Friends, welcome as we continue to journey through the story of Jonah, and today we find ourselves moving into Jonah chapter 3. Jonah is vomited up and is now in Nineveh, the place that he has been avoiding. The word vomit is not a nice word and is probably deliberate, and we are meant to recall other places in the Hebrew Bible where we hear the word vomit, and there actually are other places in the Hebrew Bible where vomit is mentioned. In Leviticus, the land is said to vomit out its inhabitants when they sin. And there's been a long-standing question amongst biblical scholars, is Jonah a commentary on the experience of the Babylonian exile? Out of the chaotic waters of the exile, Jonah is vomited onto dry land with a renewed mission, but also with a renewed vision. There's also the mention of in Proverbs of like a dog that reverts to its vomit is a fool who reverts to his folly. And perhaps maybe this reference to vomit may be raising a question for us. What do we fixate on? And how might we be open to new insights? Why is it that we sometimes return again and again to ideas which are inherently unhelpful or destructive? It would seem that the story of Jonah is raising this for the people of Israel, and it's an important question for us too. A key word in the story is repentance, which we generally equate with turning around or stopping doing bad things and starting doing good things. But that is quite an unhelpful understanding of the word. Repentance really suggests a change in heart, or a change in the mind of the heart, or better still, a change in the way the heart perceives things. That is helpful because it is the way that we see things that determines the way we do things. The story of Jonah is an invitation for the prophet, for the people of Israel, for us, to see things differently. There is a story which is something of a legend, and it has actually been proven to be untrue. And the story goes that when the Spanish first arrived in the Americas, the Native American people did not see the ships that the Spanish were coming on arriving on the ocean. They only saw the Spanish when they arrived on the seashore. And the explanation that the legend gives for this is that the Native Americans could not perceive the ships because they had never seen one before. Now, that story has largely been proven to be untrue, and I think it still holds a place in my imagination simply because I have not seen things before. Things that have been right in front of me. Things that only I've realized in hindsight as I've grown and had new experiences. But perhaps you can relate to that too. I look at photos of myself when I was younger and think, if only I had seen what was in front of me. If only had I appreciated things that I had in my life or people that I had in my life at that time. If only I had realized that I didn't look as bad as I thought I did. If only I realized that I had so much more potential than I recognized in myself at that moment. Sometimes we don't see so much about ourselves, and we don't see so much about life as we're experiencing it. Our vision is of necessity limited because we are human, but there is an invitation to recognize that we do only see things in a limited way. And just that recognition in itself opens us up to the reality that we might be able to see things differently, that there might be things that we're missing. And it makes us a little bit more curious and a little bit more open, and in a sense welcomes new realities into our life. This is in contrast to the sort of stubborn character of Jonah that we find in the story. And sometimes we need to bump into ourselves or into hard experiences to open up a little bit, to see what we need to see. Elizabeth Gilbert has this wonderful quote that I often return to. She says, "I've come to believe that there exists in the universe something I call the physics of the quest. A force of nature governed by laws as real as the laws of gravity or momentum. And a rule of quest physics maybe goes like this. If you are brave enough to leave behind everything familiar and comforting, which can be anything from your house to your bitter old resentments, and set out on a truth-seeking journey, externally or internally, and if you are truly willing to regard everything that happens to you on the journey as a clue, and if you accept everyone you meet along the way as a teacher, and if you are prepared most of all to face and forgive some very difficult realities about yourself, then the truth will not be withheld from you, or so I've come to believe. A creed is a statement of belief, within or without of a religious context. We need a Nicaea, a personal mission statement, or a personal map. We need a destination. We need to focus our attention. Most of us have a rug under the living room furniture. We don't look at it much, but it's there. Most of us have invisible creeds too. Why is it important to have some kind of creed at the center of our life? Well, because knowing what we believe and why we believe it is important to how we behave. It's important to knowing whether we matter, whether we live in a world that we make or in a world that others make for us. Nonetheless, whatever goals we may establish for ourselves by whatever creeds we live by, wherever we think we're headed, this story reminds us that we should not be surprised by sudden changes in direction. Jonah heads out for Tarshish and ends up in Nineveh. The once proud and powerful king of Assyria takes off the royal robe and puts on sackcloth. Even God changes God's own mind about the fate of the city. Everyone in the story repents, including God. Everyone experiences a surprising change in direction. Serendipity. What you find when you're not looking for it is a magnificent experience. Sometimes wonderful things happen to me out of the blue, and it's a constant reminder that grace is always trying to find us. Sometimes I think we miss the grace because we are simply unable to see it. It sometimes takes bumping up against things, hard realities ourselves, as I mentioned, to see graces we might have been missing all along the way. Jonah will be revealed in the story as the sinner because he will not change his mind about the Ninevites. Changing our minds is often seen as a bad thing, but it's not always a bad thing, depending whether we do it consciously or whether we just simply been a bit flaky. A conscious and engaged change of mind is about being responsive. And the fact that God changes God's mind in the story should not be seen as a commentary on God's omnipotence, but rather a recognition that we live in a responsive universe of grace, where grace is ever seeking us out. I was looking at an old photo of myself the other day, and it's quite interesting when you do that. You kind of look at these photos and see yourself, and you recognize yourself, but in many ways, I'm not the person that I used to be. In many ways, I am different from who I was 21 years ago. But at the same time, I'm exactly the same person. I have the same real core personality. I'm always going to be ditzy, and I'm always going to be a little bit neurotic. Nonchalant is never going to be a word that's going to describe me. Those things will probably be enacted in different ways and hopefully tempered in some way and probably channeled in a way that is a little less chaotic and a little bit more endearing. But that's who I am. But at the same time, the experiences I've had, the relationships that I have shaped and formed me so that who I am is expressed differently. If you've ever been in a bad relationship, you'll know how a relationship can change who you are. You suddenly find yourself no longer enjoying things that you used to love doing. You find yourself withdrawing from people that you enjoyed being around. If you've been in a good relationship, you'll know how it can bring out in you things that you never knew before. The world we live in is a responsive world, and to be in relationship with God means that in that interaction we are changed. We don't live in a world where there is a fixed blueprint for how life is going to unfold. Rather, God meets us and we enter into the dance of relationship. a dance of relationship where we are forever being brought back by God, who leads the dance into the rhythm of grace. It's interesting that our definitions of sin are largely punitive and based on moral achievement rather than on growth. Our moral map of the universe sometimes looks something like a snakes and ladders game. So when you do good things, you're climbing up the ladder, and when you do bad things, you're falling down the snake, and we've got to keep on picking ourselves up and trying to climb up the ladder again and again and again. I don't think that's a particularly helpful way to look at the moral universe. At the end of the day, whoever changed in their core, whoever really saw something in themselves and lived up to their best potential because someone shouted at them, criticized them, or judged them. If you're anything like me, the moments of real change and transformation in my life came when someone saw something in me that I never saw in myself. When someone in their grace named something in me that I didn't even see. And sometimes it was also looking at the example of someone who was just living into their best reality, and it inspired me to want to do the same. Grace has the power to call out in us what judgment cannot. It's interesting that our definitions of sin can take on a different shape. The Aramaic word for sin has always been something that has captured my imagination. The Aramaic word for sin literally means to be unripe. And how different would it be if I approached my failure and my shortcoming, the things in me that are broken and sometimes destructive, if I saw them as unripeness, as not something that defined who I was, but as something that pointed me towards the fact that I've still got growing to do. I think the way in which I relate to myself would be very different. The character of God in the Hebrew scriptures is chesed. In Christian language, grace. God is gracious. And what we discover in the story of Jonah is that grace can be frustrated, but it cannot be resisted, and it cannot be undone. Jonah's story features a number of reversals and contrasts between human actions and divine grace. After trying to save his own life, fleeing to Tarshish, Jonah ends up being tossed about in the stormy sea, and in the chaos and destruction, he chooses to save the life of the Gentile crew rather than his own. Another contrast in the story is that after resisting the call to Nineveh, Jonah ends up there. And even though he gives the most half-hearted prophetic utterance in the scriptures, God's purposes of grace are worked out for the Ninevites. They respond in a moment to this half-hearted message. It seems that God chooses to work through us, but God is not limited by us. God rescinds judgment on Nineveh and reverses the judgment in the story. The graciousness of God stands in contrast to the vindictive attitude of the prophet Jonah. The character of God in the story of Jonah is revealed as being persistent, responsive, and universal. God's grace is not reserved for the Israelites alone, it is universal. God's grace extends even to their enemies. And God is revealed in the story as the God who finally has no enemies. Friends, as we continue to take a look at the book of Jonah, I'm going to post some other thoughts and some invitations to reflection, which you can respond to on our WhatsApp Faith Share group or on the Facebook Faith Share group. And next week we will be joining in a discussion which will be between myself and the Reverend David Howard as we continue to reflect on Jonah together. Friends, be blessed, stay safe, and shalom.